I am David, and this is my story. There is a sound a father's heart makes when it breaks. I did not know it existed until the day I heard it come out of my own mouth, echoing through the gate chamber at Mahanaim, loud enough that the men in the streets below stopped marching and looked up. I have heard the roar of lions over slaughtered sheep in the hills of Bethlehem. I have heard the war cries of the Philistines rolling across the valley of Elah. I have heard the shofar sound over Jerusalem when the ark came home, and I danced before the Lord with everything in me. But nothing prepared me for the sound of my own voice crying out my son's name over and over, as if saying it enough times might call him back from the dead. But I am ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning of that day, when I still had hope. The waiting. The city of Mahanaim smelled of wood smoke and wet stone that morning. We had fled here across the Jordan months before, fled from my own son, from my own house, from the wreckage of choices I had made years earlier that I thought were buried and forgiven. Sin is never as buried as we want it to be. It waits. It grows roots in the dark, and one day it pushes up through the floor of your house, and you find you are living on top of a garden of thorns you planted yourself. Absalom, my beautiful son, the one with no blemish in him from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, whose hair alone weighed 200 shekels when it was cut once a year. I remembered him as a boy, riding on my shoulders through the palace halls, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. I remembered him as a young man consumed by rage after his sister Tamar was violated by his own brother Amnon. And I remembered, God forgive me, how long I waited to act, how my silence in that season taught my son that a father's justice could not be trusted. So he took justice into his own hands and shed blood. I remembered the years of exile I imposed, and then the cold half-forgiveness I offered him when he returned. I let him back into the city, but not fully into my presence. A wound left to fester teaches bitterness better than any enemy could, and bitterness had grown into rebellion. My own son had stood at the city gate of Jerusalem for years, intercepting every man with a grievance, saying, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice." He stole the hearts of Israel one conversation at a time, the way water finds every crack in a wall before the wall collapses. And then the trumpet sounded in Hebron, and the conspiracy was strong, and the people were with Absalom, and I, the king who once stood unafraid before a giant, found myself an old man running barefoot up the Mount of Olives, weeping, my head covered, fleeing my own city, fleeing my own child. I remembered how, as I climbed that hill in disgrace, a man named Shimei ran along the ridge above me, hurling curses and stones, calling me a man of blood. My men wanted to silence him. "Let him curse," I said, "for the Lord hath bidden him." Perhaps I deserved every stone. A man who has sinned as I sinned learns to hear even cruelty as something God might be permitted to use. Now here I was in Mahanaim, an old king in an old fortress, having just sent my army out that morning to fight the very army my son commanded. I stood in full armor beside the gate as my 3 commanders, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, arranged the men into 3 companies. I wanted to go out with them. I wanted, more than almost anything I have ever wanted, to be there on the field with my own hands and my own sword. But the people surrounded me and said, "Thou shalt not go forth, For if we flee away, they will not care for us. Neither if half of us die will they care for us. But now thou art worth 10,000 of us. So I stood at the gate instead, every king's cruelest post, the place of waiting while other men bleed for you. And I gave the only order that still mattered to me. I called Joab and Abishai and Ittai to me, and in front of all the people my voice cracked as I said it. Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. I do not know if any king in the history of the world has ever given a stranger command to his army before battle. Not, bring me victory, not, crush the rebellion, just, be gentle with my son. Even now, after everything, after the plots and the curses and the army raised against my own throne, he was still my boy. Love does not calculate what a person deserves. If it did, none of us would be loved at all. The watching. The battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, and I was told later that the forest devoured more men that day than the sword did. Men lost among roots and pits and thick trees in territory that turned against them like a living thing. 20,000 men fell. But I knew none of that yet. I only knew the waiting. I climbed to the space between the two gates of the wall, where a watchman kept his post, and I sat there as the sun crossed the sky and began to fall toward the western hills. Every father who has ever waited for news of a child in danger knows this particular kind of time. It does not move like ordinary time. Each hour stretches thin as beaten gold, and the mind fills the silence with 100 imagined endings, most of them terrible. I thought of Bathsheba and of the son we lost as an infant, the child who died because of my sin with her and my murder of her husband Uriah. I had fasted and wept for 7 days, trying to bargain with God for that child's life. And when the boy died anyway, I rose, washed, and worshipped, because I understood something that day I have never forgotten. Mourning cannot resurrect what is already gone, and God's mercy does not always look like the ending we begged for. I told my servants then, "Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." I did not know, sitting at that gate years later, that I was about to learn that lesson again, this time with a son old enough to hate me, old enough to raise an army against me. And still, God help me, not old enough for me to stop loving him. Then the watchman on the roof of the gate called down, "I see a man running alone." My heart lurched into my throat. "If he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth," I said, and I stood. The watchman called again. "I think the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." "He is a good man," I said, "and cometh with good tidings." I wanted so badly to believe that a good man running fast could only mean good news. Fear makes prophets of us all, grasping at every small sign for permission to hope. But behind Ahimaaz there came another runner, a Cushite. And Ahimaaz, when he finally reached the gate, threw himself down before me, breathless, sweat streaming down a face lit with genuine victory. "All is well," he said. "Blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king." I could hardly breathe past the one question that mattered. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz's eyes shifted. He had seen something, I could tell instantly, the way you can always tell when a man is choosing his words to spare you. But he did not have the courage or the certainty to say it. When Joab sent the king's servant and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. He knew. I could see that he knew, but he could not bring himself to be the one to say it. Turn aside and stand here, I told him, and I turned back toward the road, my hands beginning to tremble, though the day was warm. The breaking. Then the Cushite came, and he did not hesitate the way Ahimaaz had. Tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. Is the young man Absalom safe? I asked again, though some part of me already knew, some part of me had known since the watchman's first cry. Some part of me had perhaps known since the day I let my silence teach my son that his father's love was a locked door. The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. There it was, wrapped in careful words meant to soften an unbearable blow, but unmistakable. My son was dead. Later, I would learn how it happened, how Absalom, fleeing on his mule beneath the thick branches of a great oak, was caught by his famous hair, left hanging helpless between heaven and earth, while his mule ran on without him. How Joab, defying my direct command, took 3 darts and thrust them through my son's heart while he yet lived, and how 10 young men finished what Joab began, how they threw his body into a pit in the forest and raised over it a great heap of stones, and how all Israel fled every man to his tent. He who had built himself a pillar in the king's dale, because he had no son to carry on his name, ended his life beneath a cairn of stones raised by his enemies. I did not process any of that yet. I only knew what the Cushite's careful words meant. I felt something collapse inside my chest, some wall I had built brick by brick since the day I fled Jerusalem, some fragile hope I had been carrying without even admitting I carried it. And the collapse had nowhere to go but out. I went up to the chamber over the gate, and I wept, and as I went, thus I said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. I do not know how long I stayed in that chamber. I know that the victory my army had won that day turned to mourning in every heart that heard me, because grief carries further than any trumpet. Men who had risked their lives for me that morning came home to find their king weeping for the very son who had tried to kill him, and they crept into the city like men ashamed, like men who had fled in disgrace instead of soldiers returning in triumph. It was Joab, hard, blunt, unbending Joab, who had disobeyed me and killed my son, and yet perhaps loved my throne more fiercely than I loved my own grief, who finally came to me. He stood before me without any softness in his voice at all. Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life. In that thou lovest thine enemies, and hatest thy friends. Thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. His words were harsh, but they were not wrong. A king cannot only be a father. A shepherd who abandons the 99 to weep endlessly over the one already lost will lose the 99 as well. So I rose. I washed my face. I put on fresh garments, and I went out and sat in the gate, and the people came before me again, because a king in mourning is still a king, and there were still sheep to tend, a kingdom to knit back together, a nation waiting to see if their shepherd could stand even with a spear through his own heart. What I learned. I have thought many times since that day about the cost of unfinished forgiveness, how the years I spent half loving my son, keeping him near but never truly restoring him, planted seeds that grew into rebellion and death. I do not know if I could have prevented what happened. I only know that love delayed is love that curdles, and a father's silence teaches lessons a father never intends. But I have thought also of my own commander's rebuke, and I understand it differently than I did that day. Grief is not sin. God does not despise a father's tears. I have wept before him too many times to believe that. But grief, left to reign alone in a heart that still has a people to shepherd, becomes its own kind of tyranny. There is a time to weep, and there is a time to rise, wash, and worship, trusting that the God who gave and the God who took away is still, even now, the Lord. I buried my anger at Joab, though I never forgot what he did. I buried my grief the only way a broken man can, by carrying it forward instead of letting it bury me. And I learned more deeply than ever that the mercy I withheld from my son in his lifetime is the very mercy I have always needed from God for myself. He does not wait as I waited. He does not offer half a welcome. When we come home to him, however far we have run, however much rebellion lies behind us, he runs to meet us while we are yet a great way off. I only wish I had learned to love like that before it was too late for Absalom to learn it too. A word to you. If there is someone in your life you have half forgiven, loved from a distance, welcomed back, but never truly restored, do not wait as long as I did. And if you are the one who has run far from a father's house, know this: the God who is greater than any earthly father does not merely tolerate your return. He runs to meet you. Come home while there is still time to be embraced, not merely mourned. If you have been blessed by this story, subscribe, like, and share it with a friend.